We're so excited that you're here. We are so excited to have this program tonight. I'm Terry Robinson, and I'm the president of the South Hero Historical Society. We're into our third year, and the goal of our society is to have people who love to hear about South Hero history get together. And that's why we're so happy that you're all here, because we love to hear about South Hero history. And we have also here on our board, we have Brett Corbin in the back over there. And we have Judy Duvall is here. And where's Judy? Right. And Hazel Quelch is here. And Sue Crowley is our treasurer. And Ken Rochelo, I don't see him, and he usually does the videoing, but my brother Edward is going to do the videoing for us.
Thank you, Edward.
And Ann Quinn is here. She's our secretary. And thank you, everybody. So I'm going to let Sue Crowley introduce our speaker for tonight. And you may ask questions at any time. It's a interactive presentation. And here is Sue. Oh, and don't forget that this is one of our junior historians, Morgan Brownell, and her sister Paige Brownell. Where's Paige? And she's a junior historian too. Thank you, girls, for all you do.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody. It's always so nice to see so many people attend our events here. And this is a special evening for me because I haven't seen Mary Louise, aka Wheezy, since we were in high school in the 1950s, those glorious years. And so her sister Ann couldn't be here tonight. She's nursing a husband who had back surgery, and they're in Ohio. So Wheezy took on the job, and she lives in Maine, so she came down with her husband and is proud to bring us all the history of her grandparents who lived in South Hero here for many summers. And Ann was in my class, and Wheezy was in a year ahead. And so my sister Nancy is here, and we used to play with them when we were young girls. And my mother would bring us down, and we played on the sand beach, Jackson Beach, which at that time was a pristine a beach as nice as Daytona Beach, I would say. No buildings, just sand dunes and beautiful sand, the entire coastline until you got down to White's Beach. And it was wonderful. And they had a lovely big house there that they lived in. And so Colonel Jackson was quite a man, and we knew him. And we'd go up there sometime after high school, and her grandparents' house lived in Burlington. Is this going off? No.
It's good.
And so we knew the Colonel and Mrs. Jackson. Gotten her hair a few times, as I recall. We dressed up some of the statues in their house, and she did not like that one bit. We had wigs on them and beads and stuff like that. And and anyway, and the other thing in their house, we called it the mansion. They lived on the corner of Willard and Main. They had a stair lift, something that we had never seen anything like that before, to get the Colonel and Mrs. Jackson up to the second floor. And we used to pile on that and go up and down. That never went over too big either. So anyway, without further ado, we had a lot of fun times with Wheezy and Ann. And I will introduce now Mary Louise Blanchard, granddaughter of Colonel Jackson.
Thank you, Susie. Can you hear me in back? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just delighted to know that South Hero has a historical society, because I feel I grew up in South Hero. Many, many years of absolutely wonderful playtime, and it is marvelous to see old friends here.
Oh.
Susie and her sister Nancy, and I have to tell you that half of the Upton family is here. Hira Upton Road and her husband Soley, Audrey Upton, and Kathy Upton. I haven't seen them in years, and the Uptons live next to us in Burlington. And so we all grew up together. And they also had a place here in South Huron, off the West Shore Road, about halfway between the McBrides and Jackson Point Road.
Beach
So,
Bay.
is it Beach Bay?
Beach Bay.
Beach Bay.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. I so appreciate Susie's asking me to come and talk about my grandparents and what they did here in the Hero. And so then she said, well, talk more about what your grandfather did during his life. So I brought some other stuff too. I would like very much to have you comment, ask questions, if you have any as we go along here, because I don't really have a prepared speech, if you will. It's sort of anecdotal, memories, if you will. So call this a memoir of my grandparents and their time here in South Hero, in Vermont, and elsewhere. I wrote to Susie when she asked me if I would come, and I said to her that summers were a magical time when my sister and I were growing up because we spent them in South Hero on the farm and on the point. And let me explain to you where the farm is. The farm is down on the West Shore Road, and it's now known as Crescent Bay B&B, which is a red farm with white trim, and it always was red with white trim.
Over. Yeah, that's good. Keep going. Over. Way down. Right? Do I have it right?
Yeah, it's way,
Further. Keep going. Keep going.
it's off the chart.
Okay, it's off the chart. Okay.
It's off the picture.
Okay.
So when my sister and I were growing up, we spent the summers at the farm first and then at the point. Now the point is right there. It was known as Phelps Point. So if you see old maps, it will say still Phelps Point. But my grandmother said, I'm going to name it The Point. Capital T, capital P. And as I said to Susie, the point was a name that appeared in red letters on all our white towels and napkins. It was part of a lot of acreage that included a large cement dock, which you see right there. There was also a stone jetty, which eventually was next to the dock.
Okay.
Just about right there. Okay. Yes, thank you. Let's see where I am here. And they had a Chris-Craft, and it was moored on the stone jetty. There were 2 duck blinds because my grandfather was a big duck hunter. And one of his friends and acquaintance was Theodore Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt came at least twice to the point to hunt ducks with my grandfather. And one duck blind was off around the corner of the point, right about there, in a little bit this way. That's it, right about there. I don't think this stretches that far. No. The other one was over in just a little bit over in there.
Okay.
Over in there. So those were some of the things that I remember that appeared at the point. There was a big multi-car garage with a huge worm box. And It was there every summer, early in the summer, and we used to go in with bait cans and pick out the worms, and so that we could go fishing. There was an outside fireplace and red picnic tables, and then, much to my sister's and my delight, there was a playhouse. And it was called The Playhouse, capital T, capital P. And it was my grandmother who decided that the Point had to have a playhouse for us. And it was a very unusual building because the front was screened in and it was a huge sandbox. And then inside there were 2 swings and a hobby horse and plenty of shelves for toys and books. And Nancy and Susie would come and play in the sandbox on the swings. Well, Nancy remembers a hobby horse, and Susie remembers the swing. But we had a wonderful time. Okay, now let me tell you first of all where their time in the islands began. It began at Providence Island. They first owned Providence Island in 1903. And it's a large island, as you all know, and I'm not sure if the O'Days still own it, but that family was a family that my grandparents sold the island to. When they decided they wanted to move to the mainland, okay, to South Hero. Now, next to White's Beach, the town beach, way down here, was a boathouse. And Merce and I were driving around today, and my goodness, it's still there. And it was built in 1903 when they bought the island, Providence Island, because that's where they kept going back and forth. The stone dock cement dock is still there. Now, that's before I was born. But I do remember after they sold the island, when I was a little girl, like 4 or 5 years old, I can remember going out in the boat and having my grandfather take us all around Providence Island to show it to us. Now, Providence Island had an L-shaped dock, as you can see there. The house was up there. You can't see it because it's really in the trees. But this area here, as you see this, was an area. Those were gardens over there to the right, and this was an area where my grandfather used to fly in a Piper Cub and come in on the grass all the way into there. Yes, yes. So those were quite some times, I can tell you. Now, after they sold the island, which was in 1935, while the house at the Point was being built, they also owned the farm, which is now, as I said, Crescent Bay B&B, and it is still red with white trim. It was then, it is now. Across the way where the winery is, where they used to, where the grapevines are now, my grandfather during the Second World War grew soybeans. And he sold them to a big conglomerate who did whatever they did with soybeans back then during the Second World War. I have no idea what they were used for. But then we lived in the farm, and I can remember that wonderful Italian stonemason who has built so many of the little castles all around the island.
Harry Barber.
Harry Barber. Thank you for telling me that. Harry Barber came and built that little castle that's in the garden area at Crescent Bay B&B. And my sister and I were absolutely fascinated with how he did it. And so we watched him stone upon stone and deciding, and he would tell us what he was going to do. I'm going to put a room here. I'm going to put a tower here. I'm going to put the turret here. It was absolutely wonderful to see that. We used to play with it very, very often. We had a pony, and his name was Peanuts. Peanuts was a circus pony, and he used to go up and down stairs of the house. And he also talked for his carrots. Now that sounds peculiar. It wasn't a neigh. I have to tell you, it was something throaty, and it was just almost like he was saying carrot, carrot, carrot. It was absolutely wonderful. So we learned how to ride. We played with Peanuts. It was a joyful time. My grandmother had a wonderful vegetable and flower garden at what's now called Jackson Point Road. There's a house there right on the corner. And in there lived Jenny, Bert, and Meter. I don't know. Mercier. Absolutely. I'm not sure. Aunt Jenny. And Bert used to do a lot of the gardening for my grandmother. Anyway, they were a fixture there on the corner of the road. Then my grandparents decided that we would move from the farm to the point. And that was absolutely wonderful because of two things. The fact that we could actually swim off the dock here and go to the sand beach. And as Susie said, as you can see here, how pristine it was. It was absolutely wonderful. Not a house around it. You could also approach it from what is now Kolodny Road. You could come down that way. Or you could, as we did as kids, we walked there. We made an actual path, and I can remember my cousin Wink, William Forbes Jr., actually it's William Forbes III, my sister and I, making this trail from the point to the sand beach. Behind the sand beach were these wonderful dunes. Now, I'm sure because there are so many houses there now, there are no more dunes. But it was absolutely wonderful. I have a picture here that I will give to Morgan that shows, this is a picture of my mother and father on the beach before they were married after a very big storm. And I can remember when I found this picture and asked my mother about it, she told me all about this storm. It was a huge, huge storm. Now, it must have been in about 1934. It was just before my mother and father were married. But you can see the dunes in back and all the trees that came down. And then what they did is they had a little sort of a canopy tent where the family used to have picnics. So that was part of the sand beach there. Okay. Morgan, if you'd like to show the first two pictures here, please. The first picture here is the point as we knew it. You can see the house. It was white with dark green shutters, dark green doors. It is now owned by Charlie Tetzlaff, and it is now blue with white trim and red doors, if any of you know it. But it's still there, and it still looks very much. Of course, when I was young, it was huge, absolutely enormous. It doesn't look quite as imposing to me now, but it's still a lovely, lovely spot. You can see the concrete dock, it's still there, and then the jetty on the other side. Lots of nice grounds, and that little thing there that looks like a woman in a long dress is really a sundial. And that was just a very nice little touch that they had there. The big house there, the front of the bottom of the house where the door went in, was a windowed porch area. And that's where everyone sat as throughout the day, in the evening, after dinner, and so forth. Upstairs from it was a sleeping porch, all screened in, and a wonderful place to sleep. The L that goes back over there was a very nice, it was like it wasn't really an atrium. It was sort of like a wonderful, there were a lot of plants there. It was my sister and I used it as a game room. But it was really a wonderful spot to play games, to have a lot of fun with.
Too bright.
I can't see it on the video. Is it better on the video?
No.
No, it's okay. All
Turn
right.
one later.
Right. We'll do this one over here. That's better. That's better.
Okay. The annex here that you see there, that was my grandparents' bedroom and bathroom, and then behind it was my grandfather's. We probably would call it a work area today, but that's where he kept all of his fishing rods, his guns, all the things that you would use if you went out into the water and the woods and you were a sportsman, if you will. This building here it's hard to see, but that we called the annex. And after my father became ill, my grandparents built that so that my mother and father could have their own place to be. It had a bathroom and had a small kitchen area. So that is it. Way in back was a big kitchen, huge icebox. I mean huge. There used to be, early on, before there was refrigeration, there were actual building next to this big, like, multi-car garage, was an ice house. And the ice would be, and it was all covered with sawdust. And the ice would be brought out of the lake in the wintertime, brought to the ice house, and they used that in this enormous ice box, which would be about the size of what a very commercial building would have today. Yes?
Is the house facing west? The picture that we see, is that looking out
That,
to the west?
yes, it's looking west.
Where on the point is it? Is it on the eastern side of the point, or is it further on the west side of the point looking? In other words, where the dock is, where's the house in relationship to the
Straight
duck?
down, straight down. On that path.
On that path?
The
Okay,
house is up
yeah,
there,
okay.
okay? This is the point, the actual point here. And one of the duck blinds used to be there. The playhouse, you can't see it, but it was right in here.
trees.
Yeah, right in the trees, there.
And is that house still standing?
Yes, the house is still standing. It's owned by Charlie Tetzlaff now, whoops, and it's a different color. To us, it's always white. Okay.
Get on to Grandpa.
Yeah. Now, so that's pretty much the South Hero connection. The Providence Island first, the farm second, and the point third. The point was sold sometime, I think, in the early 50s. 1949, 1950, 1951. And the whole area that my grandfather owned was sold at the same time to a group of investors who developed the beach area and then put various houses in that area. But it was a piece of property that was, I would say, certainly more than 100 acres, and probably at least double that, not counting Providence Island, which was enormous.
I think it was mostly doctors and lawyers from the Burlington area who bought their Dr. Evasion
Yep,
and
yep.
Joseph Frank and various people like
Various
that.
people,
So they were
right.
nearby and knew about the property, knew your family. So
Yes,
it
yes.
sort of stayed with family friends in a way.
Yes, yes it did. Yes it did. Now, my grandfather was a very unusual man. He was a doctor. He and his 4 brothers were born in Canada, believe it or not, in Kingston, Ontario, because his father, Samuel Jackson, was a congregational minister as well as a physician. And he went to Canada to establish the Congregational Church in the Kingston area and was very, very instrumental in developing the congregational churches in Ontario. Okay, where is this big picture?
So, can you tell us about Jackson Point? Because
Jackson Point?
Yes.
Yes, Jackson Point is on the map. If you look at the third picture, or the big picture, Jackson Point was next to my grandparents' property. There's the
Right
point.
here.
There.
This
That's
is
right.
Jackson Point. Well, right here.
That's Jackson Point.
This is
That was owned by my grandfather's brother. His name was John Holmes Jackson. He was a dentist in Burlington. His son was Bradley Jackson. And Bradley lived there for a number of years after he came back to the state of Vermont. And it has always been called Jackson Point. Now this is a photograph of my grandparents, my mother, and my aunt. This is my grandfather here in his World War I uniform. He was a colonel in the Medical Corps, was wounded 3 times, was a battlefield surgeon, and earned many medals. And here are some of his medals. He won the Distinguished Service Cross, which was the second highest medal for Army people. In the Purple Heart, he has a Croix de Guerre from the French and the Legion of Honor from the French. And the second to the last medal is the American Legion Medal. And one of his claims to fame was that he was one of the founders of the American Legion. Shirley Campbell is here tonight, and Shirley's father was a commander of the Vermont American Legion and served on the national board. And thanks to Shirley, she's brought me some memorabilia that I will share with my sister. Thank you, Shirley. Okay, here is a picture of my grandfather wearing his medals with his colonel insignia. And that was taken at the end of World War I. Thank you, Morgan. Here is a picture of my grandparents when they were probably in their 60s. And my grandmother, whom my sister and I called Gam, and my grandfather, whom we called Jack. He was always known as Jack to many, many people. Probably the biggest thing that he'll be remembered for through history is the fact that he was the first person to drive an automobile across the country. It was done in 1903, and that was the same year that they bought Providence Island. And so the trip was from April to July. It took 63 days, and it was made on a bet. He and my grandmother were having lunch in San Francisco at the University Club one day, and some gentlemen were talking about the horseless carriage. And they were saying, oh, it can't beat the horse. It can't go anywhere that horses can. It's not going to do a thing. It's awful. It smells. It's terrible. So he couldn't stand it. And so he introduced himself to these gentlemen and said, you know, I think you're wrong. I think this is the mode of transportation for the future. So they got talking about it and eventually ended up by making a bet. They bet my grandfather $50 that he could go across the country in this newfangled contraption in 90 days, in 3 months, okay? So he took the bet, put his $50 on the table, took the bet, and the very next day, he went to a bicycle shop in San Francisco and met a man called Sewell Crocker, and he was 21 years old. My grandfather was 31 years old. Sewell Crocker was a bicycle mechanic. So he said, you know what I want to do? I want to go across the country in this automobile. Can you help me? Would you like to go with me? So it was Sewell Crocker who found the car for him. It was a second-hand car, believe it or not. And He bought the car at a premium price. He paid twice with what it was worth, twice with what the gentleman for whom he bought the car paid for it. They outfitted it with spare tires, with all kinds of things. Now the car was red. It was a wonderful vehicle. You sat on it, not in it. And it didn't run gasoline. It ran everything else you could imagine besides gasoline. And I have a picture here of the car, my grandfather, and Sewell Crocker trying to make it on what was a cart path.
Was the dog on the entire trip?
The dog is Bud, and the dog was bought in Caldwell, Idaho. They came into Caldwell, Idaho, and everybody was walking around the car, examining it, talking about what's your trip, where are you going, what are you doing, why are you going, and all of this. And this dog was sniffing around. And the owner of the dog, I'm not saying the exact things that happened, but this is what my grandfather always told us. The owner of the dog said, "This is Bud. You want him?" And my grandfather said, "Sure, we'll take him along." And the owner of the dog said, "It'll cost you $10. So they bought Bud for $10. Now, you have to remember, as you look at the car, it had no windshield. It had no top. Poor Bud kept getting sand in his eyes. So one of the places that they stopped, they bought goggles for Bud. Thank you. And here is Bud wearing his goggles. And Bud was an American bulldog. And you can see with his little, I love his ears. Thank you, Morgan. And so once Bud had his goggles, he loved it. He loved the trip. He loved everything. When they would stop in a town along the way, they'd put Bud in the car. He'd sit up in the car, guarding the car. No one was going to take anything from the car while Bud was there.
So Mary Louise, what did he name the car?
He named the car the Vermont, after his home state. Here's another photograph. Now, it's a right-hand drive, and that's my grandfather sitting up there in the right-hand drive there with the steering wheel, and Sewell Crocker, the bicycle mechanic, next to him, and Bud with his cocked ears.
Who manufactured that car? What kind of car was it?
The car was a 1903 Winton car. Now, it was manufactured in Cleveland, Ohio. It was the forerunner of the Hudson motor car, if any of you remember the Hudson car. Some of you who are my age will probably remember the Hudson car, which is no more. But interestingly enough, after the trip, the Winton Car Company used to give my grandfather a new car every year. And he couldn't use it. He used to give it to the orphanage on North Avenue. And from the from the Winton car was the Hudson motor car, and he used to give the Hudsons to the orphanage down there. As you see, the car is covered with mud. And this is how it looked as they were finishing the trip in New York City in July of 1903. And during the trip, they stopped in Cleveland. And in Cleveland, they saw the Winton people. And the Winton people said, oh, you know, we'd like to clean it up, and we want to give you some new tires, we want to do this, we want to do that. And he said, no, please, he said, I've come this far, and it's been terrific for me, it's been great for me. Because of it, I don't want to make any changes. And when he got to New York, they wanted to clean it up. He said, no, this is mud from every place I've been along the way, which turned out to be 14 states, and I do not want to clean it up. Here's a picture coming into Omaha. Now this was quite something because a lot of people had never seen a car before. This is Omaha, Nebraska. Bud is in the car, as you see. There's my grandfather, and you can see all the gear strapped to the back. So that's Omaha. This one is Chicago. There's Chicago. And this is my grandfather's riding first car to cross the American continent. And then you see the little boy there. I love that picture. Oh, yeah. And there's Bud with his goggles on. Yeah. And this one is in Cleveland. He's getting a lot of press now. As the car is coming across the country, people are lining up to see it. And as you can see, it's muddy, and they're muddy, and they're gathering quite a lot of people. Now here's a picture of a replica of the 1903 Winton, and it was taken in Washington, D.C. in front of the Smithsonian Institute. And in this picture is me and my husband on the car. And the replica of the car is owned by a man by the name of Peter Kessling, who was a relative of Alexander Winton, who built the Winton Motor Car Factory. And he had this 1903 Winton, and he replicated the trip in 2003.
How many days did it take him?
Quite a few less. It took my grandfather and Mr. Crocker 63 days. And if you remember, they left San Francisco, and they had to ferry the car across to Oakland. And then I'm not sure whether you can really see the actual mapping here of the trip. Maybe if you can zoom in, you can see. There we go.
Oh,
yes. Yeah. San Francisco, Sacramento, up through, see where Caldwell, Idaho is, and Pocatello, and then Granger, Wyoming, Omaha, Nebraska, into Iowa, Chicago, Indiana, Cleveland, Ohio, and New York, and down to New York City. It took something like 14 days to get from Chicago to New York City. So the other other days that make up the 63 was spent doing this fantastic going through no roads.
Across the Rockies.
No roads.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mountains and everything, cart paths. He often followed railroad rights of way next to the railroad, not on the tracks itself, but next to the railroad, because it was usually fairly cleared. But there were mishaps along the way. Even the first day they left, they got bogged down, lost a tire, and they had a spare tire. They put it on, but they didn't have any other tire. Along the way, I can't recall how many tires it took to reach New York City, but it was a bunch. And they used to order things, and they'd go to rail stops. Wherever the railroad stopped, they would pick up their cache of whatever it was they needed. Here's a wonderful painting that was done by a gentleman showing, I think this is, I wrote on the back, I thought I wrote on the back, I can't remember where it was. I think
It looks like Chelly Canyon.
could be.
In Utah.
It could be. I bet
You
it
know,
probably
it's a
is Utah. Probably is Utah. But this is what happened to them along the way. And of course, very often they were pulled out of these mud ruts, these wallows, by horses, by cowboys. One time, they were puttering along, and they met this woman on horseback. And my grandfather said, in a letter that he wrote to my grandmother, he said she was wearing a very nice white dress. And he said we were kind of lost then, and we said, now where should we go to get to? I can't remember where it is, but anyway, it was someplace. And she said, oh, here's what you do. So she directed them 13 miles out of their way to her house where she lived, because she wanted her family to see a car.
I love that story.
I know,
it's a great story.
It's a great story.
It is great.
Now, when I'm putting words in my grandfather's mouth, it's because they were written in letters that he wrote to my grandmother. Almost every day he wrote, wherever he stopped along the way, he wrote her a letter. And it turned out that this was really a journal of the entire trip. And it's absolutely a wonderful, wonderful memento to have, for the family to have.
How did he get them to her?
How did he get them to her? He put them on the train. Or he often, when he'd go into a town, give them to somebody who would take them to a train, and then the train would bring it.
So she would come. She came across country ahead of him by train. And
Exactly, Nancy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
I forgot to mention that.
Yeah,
she was stuck in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Yeah, while he was going off on this great adventure.
With Bud.
And right. And the thing was, it was her money that bankrolled this whole thing.
She didn't get to go.
So she got on the train and went to New York and then up to Burlington. In fact, it was her money that bought Providence Island and the Point and the farm. She was a Wells, and the daughter of General William Wells, whose statue's in Battery Park. He was a very famous cavalry officer, eventually an officer. He entered the Civil War as a private and was elected, as they did. They elected their officers. He was elected a lieutenant, and then from there went from lieutenant to captain to major to colonel to major general to brigadier general and major general, and saw many, many battles. Was wounded twice, was a prisoner in Libby Prison in Richmond, and earned the Medal of Honor at Gettysburg.
Any relation to Wells Fargo?
No, no relation to Wells Fargo, as far as we know, anyway. But his family, his father, and his wife, eventually his wife's family, built the Wells Richardson Company in Burlington, Vermont. And they manufactured Payne's celery compound, which was probably mostly alcohol, but it cured all the ills in the world that you had. And believe it or not, I have a brown bottle that says Payne's on it, Payne's celery compound on it, that was found on Pleasant Mountain in Bridgeton, Maine, by the brother of a friend of mine.
That's amazing.
Yeah, amazing. It really was. So, okay. There were many, many articles that were written about this trip, when it began, in the beginning and during the middle of it and at the end. And this is what the original Yankee magazine looked like. Yeah.
Still the same size.
Bigger now.
Yeah, not
Bigger
much.
now. Yeah. And this is I just brought this along to show you that here he is. About 2 years before he died, he died in 1952. So this was just before he died. He's in this office at the Burlington Trust Company. There's my grandmother and Mr. Henry, her favorite dog. And then this just was showing an article, and it was very well written by a man named Martin Sheridan. And I was in high school at the time, and I met Mr. Sheridan. In fact, my grandfather insisted I come out of school to meet him because he was a very well-known writer, magazine writer, newspaper writer at the time. Anyway, this is one of the stories that was written in the 1953, of course, the next year would have been an anniversary, the 50th anniversary. Here is something that came from the Burlington Free Press. And that shows the trip. And there's what he looked like when he started out on the trip. He lost, when he ended the trip, he lost 30 pounds. The trip cost $8,000.
That was a lot of money.
A lot of money in those days.
That's amazing. Thank you, Mrs. Jackson.
Exactly. Thank you, Wells Richardson. Thank you, Payne Celery Compound.
Yes.
There were some odd things that happened along the way.
So fascinating.
I'm going to put this up, and I'll have to read you some of this. This is called automobile advertising. It says here, advertisements today are slick and tricky. 50 years ago, they were full-voiced and red-blooded. In 1903, one long-forgotten Dr. H. Nelson Jackson drove a Winton touring car across the continent, and the Winton Motor Carriage Company dollars to anyone who could produce the slightest evidence showing the truth in any of the various malicious stories told by the Anvil Chorus about Dr. H. Nelson Jackson and his successful transcontinental ride with a Winton touring car. Anyway, my grandfather then said, okay, add $15,000 more. So there was a $25,000 reward if anybody could prove that he hadn't done it. So these are kind of funny things that happen as a result. Now, this all happened, as you know, in 1903. And in 1936, my grandfather ran for governor of Vermont. He was very well known all over the state. And this is one of the, it says, the Jackson News, a pre-primary issue. He didn't win. George Aiken beat him.
A worthy adversary.
Do you have any questions? Because it's 8 o'clock. Yes, sir.
I think it was, if my memory is correct, when we were down in Washington in the Smithsonian, there is a display of the car, a
Yes.
duplicate of the car with the participants, including the dog.
Exactly. Yes, and there is a very nice diorama.
Right.
And it shows them trying to get out of one of these water holes or wallow holes, what have you. In one of his letters home to his wife, he said it took 17 block and tackle tasks for us to move from one place to the next place. Was something like 100 yards. It was quite something, yeah. Because they never knew what they were going to meet up with, and of course it rained. And sandy soil, when it rains, does not become sandy soil again.
It's like quicksand.
It's like quicksand. Yes, sir.
Give him his $50 back. He's waiting.
Audrey, nice of you to mention that. The moral of the story is he never got the bet. No. Fame, but no $50. And believe it or not, the epitaph is when he came back to Burlington from New York. He was coming into Burlington, and he was, having a beautiful time riding this car, and he was pulled over and was eventually fined for reckless driving and exceeding the speed limit of 6 miles per hour. So that was the end of the trip. Bud came with him. And Bud lived to a ripe old age in the house on South Willard in Maine, where they had 3 other dogs. So he was the 4th dog, and lived a grand old life. And goodness knows what he told the other dogs about his adventure. Yes, sir.
Do you like the Ken Burns production that was done for PBS?
Very much so. And my sister and I were invited to go to Walpole, New Hampshire, where Ken Burns has his Florentine Films production company. And I was sort of the keeper of all the stuff, the letters and everything, and I took everything there and met with Ken Burns, who initially didn't think this was going to be a good story. His compatriot there was the one who said, this is a wonderful story. You really ought to do something with it. Well, he said, show me. So Dayton Duncan invited us to go down and meet Ken and take all this stuff. Well, actually, I had copied all the letters and sent them, and he was fascinated and said, I think what we could do is do this wonderful production on how people travel, how people got into the travel business, how they went from here to there in the automobile. And so he called it America's First Road Trip. And it was wonderful. Ken Burns is the most engaging man you could meet. He is absolutely delightful and very bright. This was the DVD, which some of you may even have. You probably have seen it, but some of you may have it. Is the first of his programs that was digitally done. So it was a nice, but came with a companion book, which I should have brought with you so you could see it, but it just.
He had a nice soundtrack, too.
Yes, it had all that wonderful music of the period.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, it was nice. It was good.
Are your grandparents buried in Burlington?
Yes, they're buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Burlington, and in fact, my husband and I paid them a visit today, this morning, and they're still there.
Still waiting for his $50.
Still waiting for his $50, yeah. Yes, sir.
So early on, you mentioned that Teddy Roosevelt was a visitor
Yes,
at the point, I believe.
yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
I'm sorry, I can't. All that I know is that they were friends and acquaintances, and he had gone. When the First World War came, now this is a little thing about Teddy Roosevelt, my grandfather. When the First World War came, my grandfather wanted to desperately enter the war. He was an adventurer, of course, and he was a doctor. So he tried to enlist, and they wouldn't take him because he was 45 years old. So he went to Washington, and he went wrote to Teddy and said, "I'd like to see you. I have something I'd like to talk to you about." And so and there is a letter that is written to my grandmother saying that he had lunch with Teddy Roosevelt and Mrs. Longworth, who was Alice Longworth, Teddy's
Friend.
daughter. And he said in the letter, he said he couldn't do anything for me, but he recommended me